He never imagined that signing his name on a single piece of paper would change the entire direction of his life. But that is exactly what happened the day his billionaire boss walked into the office and said 4 words that would append everything he thought he knew about love: loyalty and survival. Rowan Ashby had spent the last 3 years working himself to the bone as a personal assistant for Callaway Enterprises, juggling to side jobs just to keep his mother's medical bills from swallowing him whole, and he had long accepted that his life would be defined by exhaustion rather than joy. Desmond Callaway, the enigmatic and impossibly wealthy CEO who inherited an empire of hotels and shipping lines, was not a man who asked for favors, and he certainly was not a man who showed emotion in the office. So when he summoned Rowan into his private study on a Tuesday evening, Rowan assumed he was about to be fired. Instead, Desmond stood by the window with his jaw tight and his eyes rimmed red, and he explained in a voice stripped of its usual polish that his grandfather's will contained a clause nobody had told him about until the lawyers read it aloud that morning. In order to inherit controlling shares of the company his family built from nothing, Desmond had to be legally married within 60 days, or everything would default to his cousin Marcus, a man known throughout the industry for gutting companies and discarding employees without a second thought. Rowan listened in stunned silence as Desmond, pacing now, admitted he had no one he could ask. No partner, no prospects, nothing but a ticking clock and a family legacy hanging by a thread. Then Desmond turned and looked directly at him, and asked if Rowan would consider marrying him. Not for love, but as a business arrangement. A temporary partnership that would save the company, and in return, clear every debt Rowan's family had ever owed. For a long moment, Rowan could not speak, his mind spinning through the impossibility of the request. The absurdity of pretending to be married to the coldest, most guarded man he had ever worked for, and yet beneath the shock, something else stirred. Something he refused to name. A flicker of curiosity about the man behind the armor. He asked for time to think, and Desmond, uncharacteristically gentle, told him to take the night. Though both of them understood there wasn't really a choice at all. Not when Rowan's mother's next round of treatment depended on money he did not have. Walking home that night, through the rain-slicked streets, Rowan felt the weight of an impossible decision pressing against his chest. Unaware that this single choice would lead him toward a love more real than anything either of them had prepared for, Rowan called his best friend, Priya, the moment he got home. Pacing the cramped kitchen of his apartment while she listened, through the phone with the particular silence she reserved for genuinely serious situations, when he finished explaining, she didn't laugh, didn't tease him the way she normally would. She simply asked him one question: whether he trusted Desmond not to hurt him, and Rowan realized he didn't have an answer. Only an instinct that told him the man's coldness was armor rather than cruelty. By morning, he had made his decision, and when he arrived at the office, Desmond was already waiting, dressed impeccably as always. Though there was a rawness in his expression that betrayed how much this mattered to him. Rowan agreed to the arrangement on one condition: that everything remain honest between them, no games, no manipulation. Just 2 people helping each other survive, and Desmond nodded, extending a hand that Rowan shook like sealing the strangest business deal of his life. Within a week, the lawyers had drawn up the necessary documents, and within 2 they stood before a courthouse clerk in a small, unremarkable ceremony that felt nothing like a wedding and everything like a transaction. Though Rowan couldn't ignore the way his pulse quickened when Desmond slipped a simple band onto his finger. That evening, Desmond's driver arrived to collect Rowan's belongings, which amounted to little more than 2 suitcases and a box of his mother's old photographs. And Rowan found himself standing in the marble foyer of the Callaway estate, a house so vast it seemed to swallow sound itself. Desmond showed him to a guest wing with the stiff formality of a man giving a tour to a stranger. Explaining the household staff, the housekeeper named Mrs. Ferris, who ran the estate with quiet efficiency, and the boundaries they would need to maintain in front of others. Rowan nodded along, absorbing details he barely processed, distracted by the strange ache of watching Desmond's carefully controlled exterior crack for just a moment. When he mentioned his grandfather's old study down the hall, a room he clearly hadn't entered since the funeral. That first night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar house, married to a man he barely knew, Rowan stared at the ceiling and wondered what he had gotten himself into. Unaware that somewhere down the hall, Desmond was staring at his own ceiling, wondering the very same thing. And quietly grateful he was no longer facing this fight alone, the first few days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Both men circling each other with the caution of people who had agreed to share a life without actually knowing how to share a conversation. Rowan continued his assistant duties during the day, now blurred strangely with his new role as Desmond's husband. And he found himself noticing details about Desmond he had never had reason to notice before. The way his shoulders tensed before difficult calls. The way he lingered in the kitchen doorway each morning as though uncertain he belonged there. On the third evening, Rowan found Desmond in the kitchen at nearly midnight, sleeves rolled up, attempting and failing to make himself a simple cup of tea. And something about the sight of the powerful, untouchable CEO fumbling with a kettle struck Rowan as unbearably human. He stepped in without thinking, guiding Desmond through the process with a gentle teasing he hadn't planned on using. And for the first time since they'd met, Desmond laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised, as though he'd forgotten he was capable of it. They ended up talking until nearly 2 a.m. Not about the company or the will or the arrangement, but about small things, the music Rowan grew up on, the garden Desmond's grandmother used to keep before she passed, the strange comfort of two people who had both spent years being needed by everyone except themselves. Rowan began to see past the polished exterior into something quieter and more fragile. A man who had inherited an empire but never learned how to simply exist without performing strength. And he felt something shift inside his own chest, a warmth he hadn't expected and wasn't ready to name. Over the following days, small rituals formed between them, without either acknowledging it out loud. Desmond leaving Rowan's favorite pastry on the counter before early meetings. Rowan learning to recognize the specific silence that meant Desmond needed company rather than solitude. Mrs. Ferris noticed first. Watching the two of them with a knowing smile, she kept carefully to herself, aware long before either man was ready to admit it that whatever this arrangement had started as, it was quickly becoming something else entirely. Still, Rowan reminded himself nightly that this was temporary, a favor, a transaction with an expiration date, even as some quiet, stubborn part of him began to hope it wasn't. Unaware that Desmond lay awake in his own room each night, wrestling with the exact same fear. 2 weeks into the arrangement, Desmond informed Rowan they would need to attend the annual Callaway Foundation Gala, an event where their marriage would be tested publicly for the very first time. In front of the board, the press, and most dangerously, in front of Marcus. Rowan felt a flicker of nerves he hadn't expected. Not about the crowd or the cameras, but about standing beside Desmond and pretending an intimacy that no longer felt entirely like pretending. On the night of the gala, Desmond arrived at Rowan's door in a tailored black suit that made him look like something out of a magazine. And when he saw Rowan waiting in the deep emerald suit Mrs. Ferris had insisted on, something shifted in his expression, soft and unguarded, before he quickly masked it with a compliment about punctuality. The gala itself was a blur of introductions and calculated smiles, Rowan's hand resting naturally in Desmond's as they moved through the crowd. Both of them surprised at how easily the performance came, how little it felt like performing at all. Marcus found them near the champagne table, his smile sharp and his question sharper, probing for cracks in their story with the precision of a man who had built his career finding weaknesses in others. Desmond, without hesitation, pulled Rowan slightly closer. His voice steady as he spoke about their whirlwind romance, and Rowan, caught off guard, felt his own heart stutter at how convincingly warm Desmond's touch felt against his back. How easily he could have mistaken it for real. Later on the terrace, away from the noise, Desmond exhaled for what felt like the first time all night, admitting quietly that Marcus had a way of making him feel 18 again. Small and unworthy of his grandfather's trust, Rowan, without thinking, reached for his hand, telling him plainly that he had never met anyone more deserving of what he'd built, and the two of them stood in silence beneath the string lights. Close enough that Rowan could feel the warmth radiating from Desmond's side. Neither moved away. Neither spoke. For one suspended moment, something passed between them that neither could deny, until laughter from inside broke the spell, and they stepped back into their roles, though both carried the weight of that terrace long after the gala ended. Unaware that Marcus had watched the entire exchange from the doorway, filing it away with quiet, calculating interest. The weeks that followed the gala brought a new closeness. Neither man fully acknowledged out loud, though the distance between their bedroom doors seemed to shrink a little. More each night, as they found themselves lingering in shared spaces, long after any practical reason remained. One evening, an argument erupted over something small. A missed meeting, a misunderstanding about a press statement, but it quickly spiraled into something roar, both of them saying things neither meant, until Desmond finally snapped that Rowan didn't understand what it felt like to carry an entire family legacy alone, to never once be allowed to fail. Rowan, stung but not deterred, fired back that he understood exactly what it felt like to carry weight no one else could see, reminding Desmond sharply that he too had sacrificed everything for people who needed him. The silence that followed was heavy, until Desmond, visibly shaken, sank into the chair by the fireplace and admitted, voice cracking, that his grandfather's death had left him terrified of becoming someone unworthy of the name he now carried, that every decision felt like a test he was destined to fail. Rowan knelt beside him without a second thought, telling him gently that worthiness wasn't inherited. It was built day by day, choice by choice, and that everything Desmond had done since the funeral proved he was nothing like the ruthless man Marcus wanted the board to believe he'd become. Desmond looked at him then with an intensity that made Rowan's breath catch, and for a moment it seemed as though he might close the distance between them entirely, before pulling back with a shaky exhale, whispering an apology for burdening him with things that weren't part of their arrangement. Rowan told him plainly that he wanted to know these things, that somewhere between the fake vows and the shared mournings, it had stopped feeling like an arrangement to him. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and enormous. And Desmond's eyes softened in a way Rowan had never seen before, full of something that looked dangerously like hope. They sat together by the fire long after the tension dissolved, shoulders nearly touching, both aware that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer something either of them could pretend not to feel, even if neither was brave enough yet to say the words. Building steadily between them, in the days following that quiet confession by the fireplace, Rowan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't allowed himself to in years, telling Desmond about his father's absence, about the guilt he carried for not being able to fix his mother's illness, no matter how many extra shifts he worked. Desmond listened with a focus that made Rowan feel truly seen for the first time in longer than he could remember, occasionally reaching to squeeze his hand in silent understanding rather than empty reassurance. One rainy afternoon, Desmond surprised him by clearing his entire schedule and driving them both to visit Rowan's mother, a gesture so unexpected that Rowan nearly refused out of sheer disbelief, until Desmond insisted quietly that family mattered, especially the kind built from genuine care rather than obligation. Watching Desmond sit patiently at his mother's bedside, listening to her stories with real warmth, Rowan felt something inside him fully surrender to the truth he had been avoiding. That this had stopped being about company shares or inheritance clauses entirely, and had instead become something achingly real. On the drive home, the two of them sat in comfortable silence, rain streaking the windows, until Desmond reached over and rested his hand gently over Rowan's. The simple contact sending warmth through Rowan's chest that had nothing to do with the heater. Back at the estate, standing beneath the covered porch as the storm intensified around them, Desmond turned to Rowan with an expression more vulnerable than Rowan had ever seen him wear, admitting softly that he hadn't expected any of this, that somewhere along the way, the man he married out of necessity had become the person he most wanted to come home to. Rowan's heart pounded as he stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of Desmond's breath. Both of them leaning in with the unmistakable intention neither could deny any longer. When the porch door swung open and Mrs. Ferris announced dinner with an apologetic wince, having clearly interrupted something significant, they separated quickly, cheeks warm, unable to hide the smiles tugging at their mouths despite the interruption, both silently promising themselves that whatever almost happened would happen again, and soon, because neither of them wanted to spend one more night pretending they didn't feel exactly what they felt. Just as things between them began to soften into something undeniably real, trouble arrived in the form of a phone call from the company's head of public relations, warning Desmond that a tabloid was preparing to run a story questioning the legitimacy of his sudden marriage, complete with anonymous quotes suggesting the entire relationship was a calculated business maneuver. Desmond's face went pale as he read the draft article over the phone, every carefully constructed piece of their public image threatening to collapse under the weight of a single damaging headline. Rowan felt a cold knot form in his stomach, not because the accusation was false, but because it was uncomfortably close to a truth that no longer applied to how he felt, and the fear of losing what they'd built, both the company and each other, sat heavy in his chest. They soon discovered the source of the leak led directly back to Marcus, who had clearly grown desperate after the gala convinced him the marriage might be more resilient than he anticipated, and had decided to strike before the 60-day inheritance deadline could pass in Desmond's favor. The stress of damage control consumed the following days, meetings stretching late into the night, statements drafted and redrafted, and in the middle of the chaos, the closeness they'd built began fraying under the pressure, both men retreating into old defensive habits without meaning to. Desmond grew distant, burying himself in work the way he always had before Rowan entered his life. And Rowan, hurt by the sudden withdrawal, misread it as regret. As though Desmond had realized their almost kiss had been a mistake, born of stress rather than genuine feeling. Late one night, Rowan finally confronted him, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak, demanding to know if everything between them had simply been part of the performance after all. Desmond, exhausted and raw, snapped back that he was trying to protect Rowan from the fallout of a scandal that could ruin both their lives, insisting his silence was fear, not indifference. Though the words came out sharper than intended, the argument left them both standing in painful silence, each wounded by the other's fear rather than by any real betrayal. And for the first time since the wedding, Rowan retreated to his old guest room alone, uncertain whether what they'd built together could survive the storm gathering just outside their door. Neither of them slept that night, and by morning, Desmond appeared at Rowan's door looking as though he hadn't stopped pacing since their argument, his usual composure entirely gone, replaced by something desperate and unguarded. He apologized immediately, admitting that pushing Rowan away had been a reflex born from years of believing that caring about something too openly always led to losing it. A lesson learned the hard way after his grandfather's death left him convinced that love and loss were permanently intertwined. Rowan's anger softened as he listened, recognizing the same fear he carried himself. The terror of hoping for something good, only to have it slip away. He stepped closer, telling Desmond gently that he wasn't going anywhere. That scandal or no scandal, company or no company, what he felt wasn't something manufactured for the cameras. Desmond's eyes glistened as he finally closed the distance between them completely, cupping Rowan's face with a tenderness that contradicted every cold, guarded version of himself the world had ever seen. An asked voice barely above a whisper, "If he could kiss him?" Rowan's answer was to lean in himself, and when their lips finally met, it felt less like a beginning and more like an inevitability. Months of quiet longing finally given permission to exist openly between them. The kiss deepened slowly, unhurried, both of them pouring weeks of unspoken feeling into the moment, until they broke apart breathless, foreheads resting together, both laughing softly at how long they had denied something so obvious. For the first time since the arrangement began, they spoke plainly about what they wanted, agreeing that whatever the company or the tabloids or even Marcus threw at them, they would face it as partners in every sense of the word, not out of necessity, but out of genuine choice. Desmond admitted that he had fallen for Rowan somewhere between the late-night tea lessons and the hospital visit. Unable to pinpoint the exact moment necessity had transformed into devotion, Rowan confessed the same, admitting he had been terrified to name the feeling, for fear that speaking it aloud would somehow undo the fragile magic growing between them. They spent the rest of that morning simply existing together, hands intertwined, finally unafraid of what they had become, unaware that the true test of their bond was still waiting just around the corner, just as they allowed themselves a moment of peace. Marcus escalated his campaign, arranging an emergency board meeting where he presented what he claimed was undeniable proof that the marriage had been staged, purely to manipulate the inheritance clause, threatening not only Desmond's claim to the company, but potentially exposing Rowan to public humiliation as well. Desmond stood before the board with a composure that masked the fury simmering beneath his surface, refusing to let Marcus dictate the narrative of a relationship that had become the realest thing in his life. Rowan, invited to speak despite Marcus's objections, addressed the room with a steadiness that surprised even himself, describing not a contract or a convenient arrangement, but a genuine partnership built through hospital visits, quiet mornings, and shared grief, none of which could be fabricated for a boardroom audience. The tension in the room shifted as several board members, longtime friends of Desmond's grandfather, exchanged skeptical glances toward Marcus rather than toward the newlyweds. Sensing the desperation behind his accusations, sensing his plan unraveling, Marcus made a fatal misstep, producing falsified financial documents meant to prove Rowan had been paid for his silence, only for Desmond's legal team to swiftly reveal the documents had been forged using access Marcus should never have had to begin with. The room erupted into stunned murmurs as it became clear Marcus hadn't simply lied about the marriage. He had committed outright fraud in his attempt to seize control of the company, a revelation that instantly turned the board firmly against him. Security escorted Marcus from the building amid a flurry of legal threats and hollow protests, his campaign collapsing entirely under the weight of his own deception. While Desmond and Rowan stood together at the center of the boardroom, hands clasped, having weathered the storm as exactly what they had promised each other they would be, partners. Later that evening, away from cameras and board members and legal teams, Desmond pulled Rowan into a tight embrace in the quiet of the estate's garden, admitting that facing Marcus's accusations had terrified him less than the thought of losing what they'd built together. Rowan held him just as tightly, whispering that nothing Marcus said or did could ever undo what had grown between them. not fear, not fraud, not even the company itself. Because what they shared now belonged to no one but them, and they intended to protect it fiercely. With Marcus formally removed from any position of influence within Callaway Enterprises and facing serious legal consequences for his fraud, the company entered a period of stability it hadn't known in years. Guided confidently by Desmond, who no longer carried the weight of proving himself worthy alone, Rowan watched him step fully into his role as CEO with a newfound ease, no longer haunted by the shadow of his grandfather's expectations, but instead inspired by the quiet support of a partner who believed in him unconditionally. The tabloids, once eager to spread scandal, pivoted entirely, publishing glowing profiles of the couple whose whirlwind marriage had somehow blossomed into one of the most genuine love stories the business world had seen in years. A narrative neither Desmond nor Rohan bothered correcting, since for once, the headlines finally matched the truth. As the initial 60-day deadline that started their entire journey came and went, both men found themselves reflecting on how far they had traveled from that tense, business-like agreement in Desmond's study to the deeply rooted partnership they now shared every single day. One quiet evening, Desmond led Rowan out to the same garden where they had embraced after Marcus's downfall. The space now transformed with soft lanterns and the scent of blooming jasmine drifting through the warm night air. Rowan, sensing something significant in Desmond's uncharacteristic nervousness, felt his heart quicken as Desmond took both his hands and admitted that although they were already legally married, he wanted the chance to ask Rowan properly, without deadlines or legal clauses forcing the moment, simply because he loved him with a certainty he had never felt about anything else in his life. Kneeling in the soft grass, Desmond opened a small box containing a ring far simpler than anything from his family's collection, explaining that he wanted something that represented them, not the empire, not the legacy, just two people who found each other in the most unexpected circumstances and chose, again and again, to stay. Overwhelmed, Rowan pulled him up before he could even finish the question, kissing him fiercely, laughing through unexpected tears as he whispered yes against his lips over and over, both of them overwhelmed by the sheer disbelief that something born from crisis had become the greatest gift either of them had ever received. Under the lantern light, surrounded by nothing but jasmine and quiet joy, they held each other tightly, fully aware that this moment marked not the end of their story, but the true beginning of it. News of their engagement, real and heartfelt this time, spread quickly among friends and family who had watched the relationship evolve from cautious arrangement to undeniable devotion, and the outpouring of support overwhelmed both men in the best possible way. Priya, thrilled beyond words, immediately appointed herself in charge of planning what she called their real wedding, insisting that the courthouse ceremony, however meaningful in its own right, deserved a proper celebration surrounded by everyone who loved them. Rowan's mother, her health steadily improving thanks to treatments they could finally afford without strain, cried happy tears when Rowan visited to share the news in person, telling him she had never seen him look so at peace, so entirely himself. In all the years she had watched him carry burdens far too heavy for someone his age. Desmond, meanwhile, found himself reconnecting with extended family members who had drifted away during Marcus's years of manipulation, rebuilding relationships he thought had been lost for good, grateful that Rowan's presence had given him the courage to reach out and mend what once felt permanently broken. Together, they transformed the Callaway Estates Grand Ballroom, the same room where Desmond had once nervously introduced Rowan as his husband to a room full of skeptical board members, into a space filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of genuine joy neither man had known was possible within those walls. As wedding preparations unfolded around them, small, quiet moments continued to define their relationship. Mornings spent drinking tea, Rowan had finally mastered teaching Desmond to make, Evenings spent reviewing company reports curled together on the study couch. Ordinary rituals that meant more to both of them than any grand gesture ever could. Desmond often found himself pausing mid-conversation just to watch Rowan across the room, still faintly amazed that the man who once stumbled into his office as a stressed personal assistant had become the single, most important person in his life. Rowan, in turn, marveled at how thoroughly the guarded, isolated man he married out of necessity had transformed into someone who laughed freely, loved openly, and no longer flinched at the vulnerability of needing someone else. Neither man had planned for any of this when they signed that first legal document months earlier. Yet both agreed without hesitation that they wouldn't trade a single difficult moment of their journey, because every challenge had led them exactly where they were always meant to be. On the day of their wedding, the ballroom overflowed with flowers, soft candlelight, and every person who had witnessed the quiet, remarkable transformation of two strangers into soulmates. From Mrs. Ferris, beaming proudly near the entrance to Priya, adjusting Rowan's boutonniere with tearful pride. Rowan stood at the altar first, heart pounding with an entirely different kind of nervous energy than he'd felt at the courthouse months earlier. This time surrounded by love rather than urgency, by celebration rather than crisis. When Desmond appeared at the end of the aisle, dressed in a deep navy suit that made his eyes look impossibly warm, Rowan felt every lingering doubt from their complicated beginning dissolved completely, replaced by absolute certainty about the life they were building together. Their vows, written personally rather than recited from legal necessity, spoke of gratitude, resilience, and the strange, beautiful accident of finding real love hidden inside an arrangement neither of them expected to survive, let alone flourish. As they exchanged rings for the second time, this time chosen freely rather than out of obligation, the entire room erupted into applause. Friends and family celebrating a love story that had triumphed over scandal, fraud, and every obstacle placed in its path. Their first dance, as truly wholeheartedly married partners, filled the ballroom with a quiet, radiant joy, both men laughing softly as they moved together, no longer performing a role for anyone watching, simply existing fully and openly as themselves. Later that night, standing together beneath the same string lights from their very first gala, Desmond pulled Rowan close and whispered that he could not imagine a version of his life that didn't include him. Grateful every single day for the will clause that once felt like a curse but had become the greatest blessing of his life. Rowan smiled against his shoulder, admitting he felt exactly the same. That what began as survival had transformed into the truest, most unshakable love he had ever known. As the night wound down and their guests slowly departed, the two of them remained on the terrace long after midnight, hand in hand, ready to build a future rooted not in inheritance clauses or business necessity, but in genuine, chosen devotion. And if their story taught anything, it's that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the deepest kind of forever. So if you believe in love stories like theirs, hit subscribe, because a brand new story just like this one is waiting for you tomorrow.